Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 4th episode of Genealogy Pep Talk, a podcast. My name is Suzanne, and I'm a library specialist with Arapahoe Libraries here in Colorado. I also have two colleagues with me who are my fellow co-hosts of this podcast. There is Cindy, who is also a library specialist, and Katie, who is a reference librarian. Hi, ladies.
Hello.
Hello.
This podcast is about gathering some tips and tricks for your family search journey for whenever you get stuck on searching for an ancestor, because it does happen. We also share with you some of our own experiences, anecdotes, and stories in researching our own families. I thought that this time we would talk about houses and acreage. About a month or so ago, I just happened to catch an episode of 60 Minutes, where the interviewer was talking to a man and his family who unknowingly bought a plantation that the family's former enslaved ancestors worked on. The plantation is located in Virginia. This is a great genealogy story, and just a great story, period. I want to read and learn more about this family's discovery because it's such an interesting part of history, and to have that unknowingly and didn't know that they worked the land, and then to kind of have a comeuppance, if that's the correct word on it, or revenge, or of like I got it back, Anyway, so this kind of led me to wonder about people's family houses or family acreage and what kind of history folks can find there. Any thoughts, Cindy and Katie?
I think it would be really interesting. I was thinking about my family, and most of the places we lived were newer, built since 1950 or 1960. My grandparents lived on a farm, and I bet there was some interesting history with that house.
Was that a fresh farm in your family, or did they purchase it already built?
It was. It had been around for a while. The house, it's got the old push button light switches.
Okay.
Have you ever been to the Molly Brown house? Instead of switches that you flip, it's a button that you push. So you push an on button or an off button.
Got it.
So it's the old style. So I think it was probably earlier 1900s that it was built. I don't know for sure. But yeah, it had been around for a while when they bought it, and I think they added on a tiny bit. But
wow. See, it's like, what is the history behind that? When was it built, and how many additions were put on?
Yeah. I know that they don't farm it. They rent the land out, and somebody else farms it. But I know that they had a cow and a couple chickens at some point. But before that, I have no idea. It would be really interesting to find out if they just mainly did the farming or if they had any livestock.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting because the house is part of the family. In a lot of cases.
Yeah.
The house I grew up in is not very old. It was built in 1956. And I still can drive by it, and it just still feels like that's part of my family that's still there. To bring up another point about farmhouses, when you're driving out in the middle of nowhere and you see a farmhouse, sometimes they're just abandoned. Don't you wonder who was the last person who lived there? That a family lived in there and loved being there, and what were the circumstances that the people had to leave? Was it one of the last people of the family and they just died in there and then the house was abandoned, or what? So I always look at those houses and wonder what's its history too.
And what kind of poltergeist is lurking behind the boards?
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Oh, my goodness.
I have a fascination with abandoned houses. Not that I go in them, but I just love taking photos of them. I have some artwork at home with, depicts buildings like old churches and old buildings. And I find that fascinating because it's the soul of a house, they say, whoever they are. It's this genealogy of a house. It's, like you said, Cindy, it's this another person, if you will, because there's this life that goes on for many generations, couple of 100 years, maybe only 10 years, but it's still there. And so it'd be nice to find out who built it, who owned it, who lived there before it was even built. Was it just some trapper or, miner or, just farmer? And that's the interesting part. I think you can, I haven't done this yet, and I will, but I think you can go to the local county website under property assessors, and I think you can find that information.
Yeah, that would be some fun detective work.
Yeah.
And then in the case of older homes, probably some of the addresses have changed or the street names.
Right.
Or if it was part of a farm and then it became a development. I bet it would take some really fun detective work to find out the history of some of these older homes. Because I would love to know about these farm homes. Why did the farmer set the home in that spot? Was there a reason why it was set on that portion of the land? And you can tell sometimes that there was a home in certain places because there are trees that are planted as like a windbreak when you drive across the plains. You can see those old places that used to be homesteads, and maybe the house isn't even there, but it did contain a family at some point.
Yeah, you're right. It's always those same 5 trees that have been there, and they're always on the side of the house.
Yeah, like on the north side to keep the wind away. Yeah.
It's also, I read this a long time ago in a magazine article, doing laundry at a laundromat out of state, California somewhere. And I remember picking up this magazine, and it talked about that one lone tree that is on a farm. And it's like, yeah, how did that tree get there? Why is it just one? Apparently it was put there for shade. And then, of course, it, will build up maybe if lightning doesn't strike it. To go back to remember we're detectives because we're genealogists as well. A good way to find out some information of that house or a house that an ancestor lived in is on the census, because majority of the time they will have the house number and they will have the street address, and it'll be on the side written vertically. And we can always look at that. And I have done that. And this is a suggestion for people, is that to look up that address and then print out the picture of it. Find the image of it.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah. Sometimes in Zillow or one of those, Redfin or whatever, those realtor websites, if you can. Sometimes they're tricky. You can't print them out. But sometimes there's just an image, and you can just look at it. Maybe it's the original wood. Maybe it was torn down and rebuilt and looks fancy. Maybe it's just a piece of acreage, a piece of land that is not there anymore. I remember going back some years ago looking for my mom's house that she lived in, and there was a semi-truck on it. No house, just semi-truck, because the house was bulldozed long time before that. So.
And you were able to do that through the address that you remembered?
Yeah, I looked it up, and I took a picture of it. I was with my uncle, and so we drove by it, and he knew where the address was. And so I took a picture, and I still have it somewhere of this weird semi-truck.
Yeah, well, and that's another thing about utilizing the previous generation, because they'll remember or new stuff that we don't know.
Right.
So it's always good to try to talk to family members while you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So I just looked, here are 7 websites you can tap to trace the history of your house. Trace My House, National Archives, Family Search, Cindy's List, Old House Web, Building History.
Yeah, I was just looking at, since we are here in Colorado, History Colorado, which is a museum for all things Colorado, offers on their website house history research, and it just gives you a whole bunch of resources on where to go if you're trying to find who owned your house before that.
Yeah.
So, like, I guess there are Colorado city directories from the 1860s, business directories, householder directories. I'm not quite sure what a householder directory is. And I guess they had telephone directories from 1880. I didn't realize that they would have had a telephone book in 1880 in Denver. So they say also you can look at the federal census for Colorado, the census for Colorado State. Newspapers may have something about a house. And also, what is interesting is what happened in that house. If you go into the newspapers and you can look up an address, did something happen there, a crime or thing interesting might have happened in the house as well. Well, and they also say that some photographs are available, to view online on History Colorado or the Denver Public Library's digital collection. I've delved into that, and there are a lot of different you can Google a home that may have been famous, like the Molly Brown house we were talking about. Molly Brown lived in Denver, and her house, you can go through it and on a tour. But a lot of those homes in that area were built in the same era, maybe 1880s. You can find out through that.
So then I also did a search, and it says how to find out the history of your house. Number one was search the Registry of Deeds. Like, okay. Also check the National Registry of Historic Places. Ask your realtor. Contact previous owners if you desire. Sometimes you don't want to talk to them.
Right.
And here we go. Look up old census records. Hello. Subscribe to a genealogy website. Visit a local library. That's what we are. Historical Society or Preservation Foundation. And head to a nearby battlefield. I don't understand that, but okay. But I guess the battlefield, that makes sense because there might be some, so-and-so of blah, blah, blah town. And then you go from there. I don't remember seeing an address on my relatives' headstones.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But maybe in the old days, maybe they did something similar.
I also found from the Library of Congress, it's the Ask a Librarian part of the Library of Congress website. So if you go to ask.loc.gov, it's frequently asked questions, local history and genealogy. And it's talking about how do I research the history of my house. And it says, property records begin at your county tax assessment office or local similar entity, deeds at the courthouse, building permits and blueprints. So at the city or county level, city and telephone directories, local history, historical societies or things like that. Maps, old maps, newspapers, and photographs. So
I remember that I was talking to somebody about this, and he said the old insurance maps might be of interest. So that's a thought too.
That's very interesting.
Yeah. I'm going to ping pong here. I did a search on linkpendium.com. I'm going to give a little shout out to that website, linkpendium.com. And it's a great little site. It asks for your names of your relatives, first, last name, state, and then also country. I put all my people in. Unsuccessful, except on my grandfather's side, my mom's father, and I hit gold because they gave the addresses, and I didn't know the addresses, and it's around 1900 for about 20 years or so, and they lived on a street in Camden, New Jersey, and what it was is a linkpendium, and so it's a collection of links. So it prompted me, because I knew where they were from or born, New Jersey, and it pointed to this Camden, New Jersey history website because they were trying to keep Camden, New Jersey alive. So there's a shout out to Camden, New Jersey as well. And what it was is this person or a bunch of volunteers put this whole thing together, and I found my grandfather and great-grandparents living there. I'm like, fantastic.
Sometimes these local historical societies, but those people are so interested in their own community.
Right.
And so they have a huge interest and have knowledge that most people do not. And I have a funny example about that. My mom grew up in Little Falls, New York, and her parents, my grandparents, owned the Polish grocery store on Main Street. Well, that store was demolished in 1970, along with a lot of those things on Main Street to put the thruway through. So I walked down, and my daughter and I were there just visiting, just walking around, and we walked by the Little Falls Historical Society, and I just stepped in. And lo and behold, I was asking them, and it's very strange because the woman that I talked to, she's a distant cousin of mine. And we just figured out that we were cousins.
Wow.
Anyway, but they had an entire diorama of the main street as it used to be. And it showed, it had little markers for each little, and I found that my grandma's store was 11 West Main, and they had just this little model set up that you could see. And it was so interesting because who would go through the trouble to do that
Right.
unless you have some really passionate people about their own community?
Yeah.
So I think these small historical societies really are a gold mine.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Yeah. And I love the fact that you just happened to listen to your instincts and you walked into this place and you got a twofer out of it. You got a cousin and then you got a diorama. And you got some information from this, this community of, town folk.
Yeah, and they
how
were so
terrific.
interested because I was telling them who my mom was. They were getting her high school yearbooks.
Wow.
Like they had at least 2 of the years in the
Right.
1940s. They were looking in the telephone directory for me to see where they had lived because I know that my grandparents kind of moved around the town before they moved into the grocery store. So we wrote down the addresses, and my daughter and I drove around and looked at all the addresses, and either
Nice.
they were boarding houses or they were staying with other
Wow.
people, I'm assuming.
Huh.
But that was, I got more than a twofer. So that was really great.
Nice.
That makes me think of my grandma. She's not anymore because she's, in her 90s, and so she's finally started slowing down, crazy woman. But she, for a very long time, basically volunteer ran the Tama County Historical Society. And, so she had lived there in Tama County for pretty much her entire life. So, she knows everything, she knows all of, if she doesn't know that, this particular generation, she knew their parents or grandparents, and, she can regale you with stories of downtown when, blah, blah, blah happened. And, so.
And whose brother was there, and
Yeah.
somebody's mother was doing this. And
Yeah.
I love those stories.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
So.
And once again, libraries have this vat of knowledge, wealth of knowledge, just buckets full of knowledge. Okay, maybe shelves, not buckets. But if you do ask a librarian appointment, if you request one of those, sometimes you will get some information through the help of our reference librarians. And Katie, you mentioned something earlier about such a thing.
Yeah, recently I had someone that asked, they were looking for the history of their property. And it was an interesting situation because the house wasn't all that old. I think it was built in the 50s. And they were looking also just for information on the whole little subdivision and who the architect was and et cetera. But the address had changed. So they could look on a lot of the sites, like the real estate sites and stuff, and kind of find some information back to about 1975 and then nothing. And so they asked me to help them find that. And I saw the name of the subdivision and I got the name of the architect, and he actually taught here at DU, I think, or one of the architect school programs here in the Denver area. And so I was able to find a little bit, but not really much more than what they did. But I learned from a friend who is a former librarian and also worked for an assessor's office, I believe. Or no, it was insurance. And so she dealt with the assessors and things like
Gotcha.
I learned that there's certain stuff that's available online, and you can find quickly, and then after a certain point, you have to ask them to do a search in their vault. So if you're not finding something online, you can put in a request, and then they will search all of their records, like the computerized records, and then, more recent records that are kind of in the shelf. And then if they don't find anything there, they can deep dive into their vault and look for like the old papers and everything that are stored.
Would be fun. Yeah, that would be really fun.
Yeah. So it was really interesting to me to kind of learn. I've never owned property, so I don't really think about
right.
what all goes into that. Like,
right.
I know you have to pay taxes, etc. But so that was an interesting thing to me, because I've always used like the real estate websites and stuff like that. But for this, because it had that change of address, and so the house number, it was the same street, but the house number was just slightly different. So that's what I suggested to them, is that they contact the assessor's office and ask them to do like a very thorough search.
That's a great tool. I'm sure it costs something though.
Yeah, I think when I looked online, it was like $25 or something.
Well, that's not too bad. That's reasonable.
I think it was somewhere around there. So
Okay.
It didn't seem like it was too much.
Okay.
But it might cost a little bit of money. But it could be worth it. You could discover some really cool stuff.
Seriously.
Yeah, especially if your address has changed. At what point did the address change?
And why?
And why? And how is it demarcated in the records that 32 Main Street is now going to be 42 or something like that?
Right. I had that growing up in my parents' house, and it was in Florida, and we didn't move. The house didn't move. Nothing moved, except the house number changed, and the street name stayed the same, just the house number. And it was weird. So I always had to explain to people, no, that's not the right one. It's this one now. It changed. I don't know why. Some city person, county person decided that it needed to be changed for whatever reason. But it does happen, in the old days and in the fairly recent days.
Yeah, well, I think I've said this on a previous podcast, but my grandmother's home was 79 and a half Cottage Street. Mm-hmm. And when we went back to kind of look for it, there was no 79 and a half anymore. So they had changed the addresses. I don't know why it was a half.
I wonder if it was like one property and they built a second home, and so they're like, well, it's the same land, so it has to be the same number-ish. I don't know. That's
sort of like today's duplex, maybe. In the old days, because I think if you look at pictures, sometimes you'll see houses really close together, and they kind of look like a duplex. Maybe they're attached somehow, and maybe it's from that number or whatever. And in the old days, you maybe only had 10 houses on a street, so it was real easy. But now you have so many houses and so many subdivisions, new and then old, and so that's a lot of numbers. House numbers.
I suspect that's what it is, because she had a real large yard. She grew all her own food. She grew grapes and tomatoes and all these things. So maybe it was a larger piece of land belonging to the house next door where my aunts lived. And then they might have built that house.
Yeah.
And they didn't have anything else to call it except for a half.
So another story about how libraries are great is that, I moved a lot, first of all. So that's why I have a lot of anecdotes of where I lived in different houses and, with my folks and myself and, well, not houses, but just places to live. And so there's one place that I lived was actually in Golden, Colorado. And it was an old apartment building that I was living in at that time. And in the old days, apparently it was for minors. It was living residence for minors. It was maybe about 14 units, 1 bedrooms. And so I decided to look at how can I figure out how old this place was. It was old, and that was probably about 20 years ago now. And I went to the library, and I told the librarian what I was looking for. And she said, this is before I worked in a library, by the way, and she directed me to the telephone books. They actually had copies. And
Wow.
so someone was living in my apartment, some fella named Michael, in 1957.
Wow.
So, and at that point, I believe it was, because I remember it was 50 years, it was 2007. And it was a person lived there. So I knew at that point it was 50 years old, that building. And you could tell. It was probably older than that. But yeah, it was a lot of old. And, but at least I knew, had an inkling. And it's like, well, how many people lived between Michael and myself? How many other people lived in that apartment?
Yeah.
You know, and what kind of stories did they have? Were they boring? Were they just like, yeah, going to work, you know, have my meals and then that's it? Or were there, you know, people who are scandalous and, you know, did the nightlife at the saloon, you know, or they just went to the bingo hall and things like that. And it's then you kind of get creative and think, oh, those are pretty good stories. I'll have to make those up and add a little pizzazz to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And we'll never know that.
Yeah.
Right.
But you did find out at least how old the building was.
Right.
You know, the other thing too is even if you don't even if there's not a house there anymore, it's still interesting to know the history of the land.
Right.
Like I'm thinking of my great grandparents. Yeah, I think it was my great grandparents. They had a property which I don't believe exists anymore. I'm about 99% certain. But where I'm from, there's a settlement of Meskwaki Indians. It's a settlement. It's not a reservation because they came back and bought their land back.
Wow.
So it's unique in that because most places are reservations. My great grandparents, they used to trade with the Meskwaki, and so they had a house right, which I believe would now be part of the settlement land.
Wow.
So you know, it's a really fascinating history, and I think actually the house might have burnt down. I'm not sure, but so it's not there anymore. It would still be really interesting to just to know that history of like, well, my great grandparents lived right next to the settlement and traded, and my family actually, the Meskwaki women taught my great grandmother how to make fry bread.
Oh, wow.
And so I'm the fifth generation in my family to make fry bread.
Wow.
So,
Nice.
That's great. Nice.
So that was a good trade.
Yeah.
Very good trade. Well, speaking of buildings not there, I would go back and have lunch with friends, and we'd meet in Golden every couple of months, and I'd always kind of drive by the old apartment building. And it just kind of got a little weary after I had left, and I'd been gone from there about 10 years now. And so one day I looked, and it was gone. They bulldozed it.
Oh, wow.
Oh.
And which is fine because I think it needed a redo. The building needed a whole new hairdo because it was old, it was getting dilapidated and so forth.
Yeah.
And you would never have known that old apartment building that I lived in there was there unless you did history or unless you lived there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so then what was there before that old apartment building? What was on that property before?
Yeah.
And there you go. You can get your philosophical and
Yeah, there's this corner in Denver where I grew up, and there was a dairy. It was always a dairy there. No cows, but
Yeah.
what I mean. And it was there forever. And maybe 5 years ago, I drove by and the dairy was gone. And then they built some new apartments. So, but those people living in those apartments have no idea. That was like a country dairy for years and years.
So here's a funny story. I love funny stories and weird stories. So back in the 70s, my dad owned a bookstore. in the little town where I was born, and it's kind of cool. I was born in a old whaling town on Long Island, New York. And so my dad had this bookstore, and it was in an old building. And it was the 70s, remember, so there was a recession. So actually the bookstore didn't last that long. And I remember the year because it was the year that Nixon resigned, because no one was coming in the bookstore, but my parents and I were sitting around watching the Nixon's resignation. So that was a good time. Okay. I went back in 1991, and it was the bookstore was a Chinese restaurant.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know, between the 70s when my dad closed up and to the 1991, what happened in between. And then next to it, in the same building, if you can visualize two storefronts, with those rounded kind of window seat kind of, that kind of thing. And the other side, when my dad had the bookstore, was a dance studio. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But not if you are a customer trying to read in a bookstore and the tap class comes up.
Passes in.
So we'd hear tappity tap tap tap, ball shuffle. Anyway, so that was fun. So then when I came back, it was this Chinese restaurant, and then where that dance studio was, it was like an old artist co-op. That was kind of a cool shop.
Yeah.
Pottery and stuff. That's kind of my thing. I like that. And then I was looking for the address to show my dad a few years ago, and to see pictures of it, see what's changed. And I couldn't remember the address. All I knew was that it was kind of diagonally across from the main post office of this little town. And I ended up finding it. And what it was this Italian restaurant that had both storefronts.
Oh.
Mind you, there was a second floor above, which when my dad had the store, it was a lawyer's office and maybe a couple of things like that. And then down below, kind of basement level, because the back door, you take stairs up, but it would go out to the parking lot, which would go out then near the water, and then you could pick up the ferry to get to Connecticut. But anyway, so when I saw this picture just a few years ago, this Italian restaurant had been there since 1991. And then I meet someone here, a coworker, fairly new, who is from that area himself, and he's actually eaten in that restaurant.
Oh, how weird.
Crazy.
So, yeah. So that's all kinds of cool stuff like that. I love that kind of synchronicity and neat stuff.
Even with buildings, there's only
exactly
6 degrees of separation or
exactly,
something.
Exactly. But then I looked at the pictures and I printed them out of the inside of the restaurant. So now I kind of want to go back, because now I want to say, hi, my dad had a bookstore here. Can I have some spaghetti? Because it's an Italian restaurant.
Cool. Yeah.
Anyway, but what was funny is that the floor, I was looking at the floorboards, and they're that old, wood floor.
Yeah.
Big planks, wide planks.
Yeah.
And that's what I remember. It's kind of neat because it's this evolution of a building.
Right.
The evolution of a house is who lives there, how many additions are added. But this building, this commercial building, it's, how many people live there in the beginning? How many people have had an office or a storefront or whatever. And it's fascinating to do your research of a house, or maybe a parent or a relative had a store or some sort of business. And it's your history because it's your people and your family and your relatives and ancestors.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I wish my grandparents' grocery store were still there, because they lived upstairs. My mom and her sister and her parents just lived upstairs, so my grandfather's commute was just coming down the stairs. Mm-hmm. Didn't have to worry about a traffic report,
No traffic jam there.
Yeah.
Well, traffic jam if you stopped in the jams and preserve aisle. See that? See what I did there?
Bump, bump.
That's called a little joke.
That was
You're welcome.
Sticky.
You're welcome.
Talking about going and looking for pictures of houses and stuff, that kind of thing, looking for my ancestors, like my great-grandfather and where they lived in my hometown, then it brought up pictures of how my town used to look. And my hometown is just not a lot around, not much to do. We had a movie theater. It was a town of about 27,000, so it's not tiny, but it's not very big either. But back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, even up to about the 1950s, it was actually a pretty bustling town. And downtown was pretty exciting and, beautiful buildings, and the train came through. And it's interesting to see my town in a different light, and like, wow, this actually used to be kind of a cool place, unlike now.
Oh yeah.
So you start looking for addresses and pictures of houses and whatever, and then you're like, oh, what did that street look like? And then, oh wow, look at Main Street, how busy it was. And look, there, the train station was actually a train station, not just some dilapidated building like it is now. And that's pretty cool, especially I think in the smaller towns, to see what they used to be. As to, of course, sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes there's small towns that were nothing and then started growing up. But I just love history, so it's really fascinating to see that stuff.
Yeah.
I agree.
And like a sense of place is a sense of the people who used to be there. I mean, that's why people go and visit castles in England or Independence Hall in Philadelphia. It's just when you go there to those places, you're kind of overwhelmed, or just feel that sense of who was in there.
Yeah.
And that in a house, why should a house be any different?
Right. So I was looking up my mom's mother's father's side. There we go. And he was the immigrant ancestor from Germany. And he moved to, ended up being in New York City. And that's where he met my, however many greats that is, great-great-great-grandmother. And so I was looking, because I was quite successful in finding out some birth records for, they had 13 children, by the way.
Whoa.
Wow.
13, that's a lot. And so there was a lot of birth records to look through and so forth. But it was funny because some of the addresses could be so-and-so number street, 7th Street. And then I remember there's one that says corner of 13th Street and something else street. But it's corner of, because you could do it because there's not a lot of people living there.
Right.
And maybe it was a little easier to find. Now, in a city, what's the famous phrase of 8 million stories in New York City and, 8 million people? And imagine having 8 million addresses. That's a lot to look up. But in a not as populated city over 100 years ago, that's corner of.
Wow.
That's
great.
easy to find.
That is great. Maybe that was the only home on the four corners. Maybe
Right.
those were other businesses, or maybe
Right.
there really wasn't anything there.
And maybe they didn't really have a street, name at that time, too. Who knows?
Right.
But that's kind of interesting how that evolves, too, because then you have a lot more population in that area, and then the years go by. And, well, I think we need a street sign here with a cross street so we can find people.
Yeah.
That makes me think of, too, like the evolution of phone numbers.
Oh, right.
Listening to my grandma talk about how their first number was like 29. Really? They're 10 digits now.
Yeah.
So like,
Seriously.
and it was you had your local
Yeah.
operator, and of course everybody in a small town, everybody listening to everybody else's
Right.
calls.
I'm sure they did.
More rabbit holes.
Right.
Yep.
You're
There's
welcome,
so
people.
many.
Yeah, and it's always like the letters, too. Well, hey, Madge, can you put me to, so-and-so K684521, whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, just a second. Hey, how's the farm going? How's the pig farm going? And then they'll, have a little chit-chat. Oh, okay, connecting you through. Okay. I don't know, I just made that up. It was a little character I just made up. But
My mom lived in that small town, Little Falls, and she would say that, the operator knew everybody and everything.
Right.
So you had to, if you didn't want her to know, you didn't say it over the phone.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, the good old days.
Yeah.
Don't forget to come to your local library. Here we are, Arapahoe Libraries, and we can help you find maybe your house. Certainly a family member or two with genealogy help. And not to add to the fun, also, when you drive by a house, when you drive by an old building, abandoned, when you drive by an old commercial building or an old store, remember there are stories there as well as in your family tree. There are some houses and stores and buildings that will have a bunch of stories, and maybe it's your job to find out what those stories are. So just come to the library and we can help you. For sure. And here's our disclaimer. To add to the fun, the three of us are not certified genealogists. We are just three people who are sitting around and having a gab fest about genealogy. We hope that some or all of this information helps you along the way to finding your family. Thanks for listening. Okay, it's time to say goodbye, ladies.
Goodbye, ladies.
Excellent. We'll see ya.